Welcome back to Zuko Chess. I hope you're all doing well and are blessed with good health and plenty of fortune from above. Amen. Today, we're going to dive into a classic King's Gambit played by none other than Magnus Carlsen during his match against Wang Yue at the King's Tournament Cup 2010. This is from the fourth round, and it's a real treat for all chess lovers out there. The game starts with Magnus playing e4, and Wang Yue responds with e5. Right away, Magnus goes for the aggressive King's Gambit with f4, but Wang Yue chooses not to accept the gambit, instead playing d5. Magnus takes the pawn on d5, and Wang surprises us by capturing the pawn on f4. We see knight to f3 from Magnus, followed by knight to f6 from Wang. Magnus then develops his bishop to c4, defending the d5 pawn. Wang Yue decides to capture the d5 pawn with his knight. Magnus doesn't waste any time and castles short. Wang responds with bishop to e7. But Magnus has something else in mind. He trades his bishop for Wang's knight with bishop takes knight, and Wang recaptures with his queen. Queen takes bishop. Magnus develops his knight to c3, and Wang retreats his queen back to d8. Magnus now pushes his pawn to d4, taking control of the center, and Wang decides to castle. Magnus keeps the pressure up by capturing the pawn on f4 with his bishop, and Wang goes for the Abyssinian defense by playing bishop to f5. Magnus calmly moves his queen to e2. Wang continues with bishop to d6, offering a bishop exchange and eyeing Magnus' queen. Magnus takes the bait with bishop takes bishop, and Wang recaptures with his queen. Queen takes bishop. But Magnus is up to something tricky here. He plays knight to b5, an interesting move that forces Wang's queen to retreat once again. Wang moves his queen back to d8. Magnus continues by pushing his pawn to c4, and Wang strikes back with pawn to a6, attacking the knight. Magnus simply moves his knight back to c3, and Wang develops his other knight to d7. Magnus brings his rook to the action with rook to d1, and Wang develops his bishop to g6. Here, Magnus plays queen to f2, and Wang responds with rook to e8. Magnus calmly pushes his pawn to h3, giving his king some breathing room, while Wang counters with rook to c8. Magnus then brings his other rook to e1, looking to simplify the game. Wang agrees and trades rooks, and Magnus recaptures with his rook. Wang pushes his pawn to c6, but Magnus is relentless, pushing his pawn to d5. Wang responds with knight to f6, and Magnus places his queen on d4. Now, Wang captures the pawn on d5, and Magnus recaptures with his knight, offering another exchange, which Wang accepts. Magnus takes back with his pawn, and Wang moves his queen to d6. Magnus doesn't back down and plays knight to e5, putting pressure on Wang. Wang brings his rook to g8, seemingly defending, but Magnus plays rook to e3, preparing for more action. Wang moves his rook back to d8, and Magnus plays his knight to c4. At this point, if Wang tries to take on d4 pawn with his queen, Magnus can exchange queens and deliver a checkmate with his rook on e8. Instead, Wang plays queen to f4, offering a queen trade. Magnus declines and plays rook to e5, keeping the game sharp. Wang pushes his pawn to h6, and Magnus answers by advancing his pawn to d6. Wang brings his bishop to f5, but Magnus continues his attack by placing his knight on b6. Wang replies with bishop to e6, but Magnus calmly pushes his pawn to d7, closing in on victory. Wang moves his king to h8, but at this point, Magnus has full control. He pushes his pawn to a4, and Wang counters with pawn to g6. You can feel the tension building. Magnus responds with queen to c3, and Wang shifts his king to g7. Magnus presses forward with pawn to a5, and Wang pushes pawn to h5. Magnus responds by advancing his pawn to h4. In a bold move, Wang captures the d7 pawn with his rook, but Magnus exchanges rooks. Wang recaptures with his knight, and Magnus recaptures with his bishop. Wang now moves his queen to d4, but Magnus answers with bishop to c6. Magnus then pushes his pawn to b4, and Wang tries to hold on by playing bishop to b5. But Magnus is in full control. He moves his king to h2, and Wang places his bishop on a4. Magnus moves his rook to d5, and Wang responds with bishop to c6. We've now entered a critical endgame, and exchanges are inevitable. Magnus trades queens, and Wang recaptures with his king. Magnus now moves his rook to c5, and Wang moves his king to e6. It may look like a draw is on the horizon, but Magnus shows us once again why he's a master of tempo. He moves his king to g3, and Wang pushes his pawn to f6. Magnus calmly advances his king to f2. As the game reaches its climax, Wang plays bishop to d5, and Magnus responds with pawn to g3. Wang pushes his pawn to g5, and Magnus counters with pawn to g4. The tension is palpable. One wrong move, and Wang's defense will crumble. If Wang captures the h4 pawn, Magnus will take on h5, and his pawns will rush to promotion. Wang captures on g4, but Magnus ignores it and pushes his pawn to h5. Despite the chaos on the board, Magnus is laser-focused on promoting his pawn. Wang brings his bishop to e4, but Magnus plays rook to c7. Wang pushes his pawn to f5, and Magnus pushes his pawn to h6. Wang, now desperate, pushes his pawn to f4, but Magnus calmly advances his pawn to h7. Wang tries to create a last-minute skirmish with pawn to g3, checking Magnus' king, but Magnus simply moves his king to b1. Wang pushes his pawn to f3, but it's too late. Magnus promotes his pawn to a queen. Wang tries one last trick with pawn to f2, checking the king, but Magnus moves to e2, and the game is practically over. Wang delivers a final check with bishop to d3, but Magnus moves his king to e3, and Wang resigns, knowing there's no escape from the inevitable. The best move here would be for black to promote the queen. But if that happens, Magnus will give a check, showing no mercy, and it will certainly end in checkmate. If the king runs to the f-file, black will lose the queen, and once again, Magnus will be up in material. The best move in this position is king to d5. Magnus follows with a check, rook to c5. The king moves to d6, but Magnus delivers another check. There's no escape. The king moves to d7, rook to c7, and black's king goes to d8. Then it's checkmate by the queen on e7. That's why when Magnus' king moved to e3, black immediately resigned. What a game! Magnus once again shows us why he's the greatest. After seeing how Magnus Carlsen masterfully executed the King's Gambit in a modern tournament, let's now travel back a few centuries to the time of Gioachino Greco, one of the pioneers of chess, who also used the same opening. While the fundamental strategy remains similar, their styles and approaches highlight how the game has evolved while still maintaining its tactical core. Let's compare how these two masters played the King's Gambit across different eras. Let's dive into the analysis. Hello, everyone. In the previous game, we reviewed how Magnus Carlsen skillfully used the King's Gambit in his opening. Today, we're going to dive deeper into the King's Gambit, exploring its origins and strategy in detail. The King's Gambit is one of the oldest and most classic examples of gambit play, popularized around the 16th century. For today's session, I've gathered some games from the legendary Gioachino Greco, one of the strongest chess players of the 17th century from Italy. Greco's name has become iconic, with many opening variations and defenses bearing his name, such as the Greco defense, Greco Gambit, and Greco opening, to name a few. Without further delay, let's dive into one of Greco's games using the King's Gambit. The game begins with e4, e5, f4. Why is it called the King's Gambit? Because the gambit here is used to facilitate an early attack on the opponent's king or the opponent's kingside defense. White offers a pawn sacrifice, and if accepted, gains the initiative to launch an attack. This particular game was played in 1620, and interestingly, the name of Black's player isn't recorded in the database, only Greco's name appears. So, let's explore how Greco handles this. Black accepts the gambit by taking on f4, and White follows up with bishop to c4. Here, there are two main variations, bishop to c4 or knight to f3. In this game, Greco plays bishop to c4, and Black immediately responds with queen to h4, delivering a check. Greco plays king to f1, since g3 would be met by pawn captures g3, and White would lose the rook on h1. Next, Black develops with bishop to c5, threatening checkmate on f2. White pushes d4, and Black retreats with bishop to b6. Now, White develops with knight to f3, and Black blunders by playing queen to g4. Greco seizes the opportunity and plays bishop takes f7, check. The king captures the bishop, and White strikes with a fork, knight to e5, simultaneously checking the king and attacking the queen. This is known as a discovered attack, where either the knight or bishop could capture Black's queen. Black responds with knight to f8, but after White's knight captures the queen on g4, Black resigns. This was a very short game, only 9 moves, showcasing Greco's aggressive and tactical style, which is characteristic of the King's Gambit. This one is also from 1620. This time, the game is a bit longer, consisting of 23 moves, and here you can see from one move to another, Greco consistently applies his aggressive style, always attacking the opponent's king. It starts with e4, e5, f4, Black captures with e takes f4, and then knight to f3. Earlier we saw the variation with bishop to c4, but now we are looking at the knight to f3 variation, which differs in that it prevents Black from delivering a check on h4 with the queen. Then, White plays g5 followed by bishop to c4. This combination of knight to f3 and bishop to c4 is very typical in the King's Gambit because the King's Gambit often involves combinations or sacrifices on f7. f7 is the primary target for White players who use the King's Gambit. Whether it's bishop takes f7 or knight to e5 or knight to g5, depending on the situation, the goal is always to attack f7. Now let's continue. Black isn't playing defensively here. Instead, Black tries to be more offensive by pushing g4. But unfortunately for Black, White can be even more offensive. White plays bishop takes f7 check. The bishop is captured by the king, and then White delivers a check with knight to e5. The king chases the knight, and White follows up with queen takes g4. The king captures on e5. You can already see that White has lost 2 pieces, but the compensation is clear. Black's king is being chased and has entered a checkmating net. That's the compensation Greco was aiming for. Next, White plays queen to f5, king to d6, and White pushes d4. White realizes that the cooperation between the queen and pawns isn't enough to secure the win. So by advancing the d4 pawn, White brings the bishop on c1 into the attack, ready to assist the queen in attacking the Black king. Black plays bishop to g7, and White responds with bishop takes f4, king to e7, bishop to g5. The attacks just keep coming relentlessly. Black plays bishop to f6, and White pushes e5. After Black captures the bishop with bishop takes g5, White plays queen takes g5 check. The king moves to e8, and White continues with queen to h5 check, king to e7, and now Greco castles. This is a brilliant move not only to secure the safety of White's king, but also to activate the rook on f1, which is now ready to join the attack. The combination of the rook on f1 and the queen on h5 is set to deliver a devastating blow to Black's king, leading to checkmate soon. Black tries queen to e8, but White delivers another check with queen to g5. The king moves to e6, and white brings the rook into the attack with rook to f6. Black tries to defend with knight takes f6, but white captures the knight with queen takes f6. The king moves to d5. Now you can see, white initially sacrificed two minor pieces, a bishop and a knight, and now, with this attack, white has given up two more major pieces, a bishop and a rook. But I'm sure Greco had calculated all of this and knew that the game was heading towards a checkmate. Greco continues with knight to c3. The black king captures the pawn on d4, and white delivers another check with queen to f4. The king moves to c5, and this sequence of moves forces black towards a checkmate. White plays pawn to b4, king to c6, queen to c4, king to b6, and finally, checkmate with a knight. From start to finish, you can see that white always had the initiative, constantly attacking, and even willing to sacrifice material to achieve an ideal attacking position against black's king. That concludes a few games featuring the King's Gambit. For Magnus Carlsen, we saw the King's Gambit declined, whereas with Greco, we saw the King's Gambit accepted. From these examples, we can learn a lot about how the King's Gambit can be applied in different scenarios. It all depends on your playing style. Happy learning, and don't forget to practice on the chessboard. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.